Hi, this is Mark Elliott back again, and I'm here pretty much to say goodbye. We have finished the last of the modules for part 6 of ChinaX, which has been about the Manchus and the Qing. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to recap briefly and to talk about where we've been and what lies ahead. We have brought you up to about the year 1800, really 1795, with the end of the Qianlong reign. And that's where I'm stopping. The Qing, of course, continues beyond the Qianlong emperor we talked about in the preceding lecture. His son, the Jiaqing emperor, takes over. He is followed by a number of other rulers, the Daoguang emperor, the Xianfeng emperor, the Tongzhi emperor, the Guangxu emperor, and then the last emperor, Puyi, who comes to power when he's, well, doesn't really come to power at all. He's just really a baby when he's put on the throne in 1908. So we have many, many more people occupying the throne of the country. And that represents a major change from the first part of the dynasty when, as you may remember, I mentioned that one of the things that really helped make the Qing strong was the fact that it had very few rulers ruling for a long time, and all of them quite competent and quite dedicated. That's not to say that the 19th century rulers were not as dedicated. The Daoguang emperor, for instance, seems to have been quite a dedicated sovereign. The Tongzhi emperor, an intelligent man. The Guangxu emperor also, somebody with real intentions, thwarted in those good intentions to try and modernize the country. So the failure of leadership is not one so much of a personal failure, I would say, as it is one of maybe more of a structural one. But these are issues that Professor Kirby will be talking about in part 7, which is where things will pick up, starting more or less, like I say, from the very end of the Qianlong reign. We began in the late Ming, so the early 17th century, the weakening of the Ming dynasty, plagued by rebellion and also by a troublesome people up in the northeastern frontier, people calling themselves at first the Jurchens, but then later they changed the name, of course, and start calling themselves Manchus. Manchus take over in 1644, first all of North China, and then gradually extending their control over all the rest of the country with the final suppression of the rebellion of 3 feudatories. They succeed in uniting all of China proper under their control. And then over the succeeding decades, up until around 1760, they extend the empire, they build the empire out further into Mongolia, into Tibet, into the eastern part of Turkestan, which they later name Xinjiang, the new frontier. So we see the doubling of the empire, we see a rough tripling of the population. And these, if we just were to name 2 things, these would be maybe the 2 big trends to think about with the Qing that have major implications for modern China. And as I said in the preceding lecture, that is one of the reasons why the Qing matters so much, because the Qing is the last dynasty, right, to come before we get to the story of modern China. And the big story there, of course, is China's epic encounter with the West. That encounter really takes the place of what had been the determining historical encounter with an other for most of Chinese history, and that encounter was with the inner Asian other. Qing China, as we leave it in 1800, is still a very powerful state. It is economically certainly the largest economy in the world. One of the things that you will learn more about in part 7 has to do with the trade imbalance between Great Britain and the Qing Empire, where the British are importing enormous amounts of tea, as well as other goods, china, among them silks. and nothing to sell really to the Chinese in return. So they are running a terrible deficit trade with the Chinese, and what ends up happening is one good is substituted into this mix, which then helps to reverse that trade deficit and create a surplus for the British. That good, of course, being opium, which was the single most profitable commodity traded in the world in the 19th century. But why do we stop in 1800? It's not, as I said a minute ago, it's not the end of the dynasty, and we've been tending to end with dynasties. And this maybe is a good moment for us to pause and think a little bit about what historians call periodization. We tend to think a lot about this. When do we start our stories? When do we end our stories? What are the significant moments? Who are the significant people? What are the significant events that lead us to believe that whatever narrative we're telling has come to some kind of a conclusion, even if not a definitive conclusion at a certain point. We can look at 1800 and we can say, this is the end of traditional China. Well, I'm not sure that that's true. We could look at 1800 and we could say, this is the end of early modern China. That might be a little bit more true, but then we would need to get into a discussion of what early modern meant. Early modern, of course, also implies that there's a modern that's coming. Some historians would not go along with 1800 as the breaking point or as the terminus here. They would say, no, that should be 1839, 1842. Those are the years when China and Britain went to war for the first time, the Opium War, as it's called. And for many historians, particularly historians working in a Marxist framework, the Opium War marks the beginning of modern Chinese history. And there are some good arguments to be made there. We back up to around 1800 because it seems important to, when we look at some of the secular trends, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by secular trends. When we look at secular trends, it seems that things are beginning to build around that time. By secular trends, I mean the broad sorts of shifts in society, in economy, in thought that aren't wedded to political change of one regime or another. It's in around 1800 that we see that the models for the way that economies should work together that have been developed in the West are no longer compatible with those models that have been developed in East Asia. So that's a kind of secular trend, again, that has is irrelevant in terms of who's in power specifically, that suggests that there are other things happening at this time. The fabric of Chinese society becomes stretched in ways that it had never been stretched before. So the effects of some of these things that we've spoken about in terms of things going on in the Qing start to have longer term consequences. And those really start playing out after around 1800 or so. So thinking back over the last few weeks of this part 6, remembering the conversation that I had with Grace Jackson when we began all of this, I would have to say that one of the things that I've been most struck by, and what I think has been one of the great successes of ChinaX, has been the degree of involvement between the professor and you, the learners. Taking part in the discussion forums, reading all of your responses, really vocal and often very personal contemplations, reflections that people have shared with me and with their fellow learners on the edX platform has been really something. It's of course different from conversations that you might have in a classroom, but I have also found it extremely rewarding, and I hope you have. I hope you have too, and I hope as you go forward, you will continue to be as generous in your comments as you have been for this part. I think one of the things that I hope you've come away with is a more nuanced sense of the different kinds of people who have been part of the making of China. The Manchus in particular, I think, had a very important role to play. And I hope that the lectures have helped you to see the ways in which the Qing combination of inter-Asian political traditions with Chinese political traditions have been responsible for the emergence of a particularly successful hybrid state in the Qing that was able to sustain tremendous territorial growth as well as economic growth, cultural growth. The Chinese cities become just tremendously vibrant places with theater districts and restaurant culture and a shared literary vocabulary that novels, everybody is reading the same stories. It is very much knitted together through its cities, through the very active commercial networks that help to make this prosperity reach into areas where it had never reached before. If you talk to your average high school graduate in China, most of them will say the Qing, that was just not really such a good time. The country was overrun by foreigners, first the Manchus and then Westerners. China lost its place in the world. It became weak and couldn't defend itself. And those points are true to a certain degree, and they're particularly true, as you'll see, in the 19th century. But as I hope that the lectures that we've had so far in part 6 here have shown, that's not the story of China under Qing rule in the 17th and 18th century. The Qing Empire then was a powerful country with a vibrant economy, and the accomplishments then under the Manchus are accomplishments of which I think all Chinese can be proud. The Qing emerges out of this part of the course as the forerunner of the multicultural, pluralistic, polyethnic China we see today. Qing China was also a quilt of different peoples and languages and religions and geographic zones. That part of the empire is a legacy that remains a big part of the story of modern China up to today. Thanks for being with us.
This is the conclusion to part 6 of ChinaX. It's also the last part of the course that I've been involved with. And you've just heard a number of modules from Mark Elliott, my colleague, and Bill Kirby's colleague, teaching the history of the Qing dynasty and the Manchus. I want to thank Mark for stepping in and doing that. And Mark also talked a little bit about why, in some sense, we have a transition at this moment in around 1800 in the course. Bill Kirby will be taking over in September with the modern China element. In fact, we're going to put on a new logo, and we'll send you an email inviting you to make suggestions for a new logo, or at least that's what the staff tells me we're planning to do. We hope you'll use this summer to catch up on earlier modules if you haven't had a chance to. We'll be working this summer too to try to develop the second version of some of our modules as we try to improve them based on the comments you've made and the things you've liked and disliked. You know, I wanted to think for a minute about some of the things Mark Elliott had said. He can't be here today. He's abroad. Bill Kirby's abroad as well. In fact, Bill is in China with Chris Lydon, and they're trying to put together new materials for ChinaX, particularly having to do with the environment. Well, I wanted to think a little bit about some of the larger issues of the Manchu Empire. Because after the Song dynasty, right, it's fair to say Chinese dynasties, that is the Song and the Ming, are really states. They're not empires. They don't include lots of other peoples, or even if they wanted to, they were not successful in being able to do that. In the last 1,000 years, China has, as a whole, has been incorporated twice into empire, but not by the Chinese, but by the Mongols first, and then the Manchus second. And you can imagine that in the 20th century, people looked at the Manchu, early 20th century, at the Manchu conquest and said, these were foreigners coming into our land. And there was truth to that. The Manchus were not Chinese speakers. but they learned to become good rulers of China, as I think Professor Elliott has given you a sense of. But there is a way in which the Manchu Empire became thoroughly Chinese. It became the basis for the China of the 20th century, both the Republic of China and then the People's Republic of China. Their borders, the size of that country, owes enormous amounts to the Manchu's Qing Empire, Qing dynasty, the great state of Qing. Looking back on this course, I've asked myself sometimes, well, when I began to study China back in the 1960s, this was sort of the feudal traditional past, the dead China. And I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in the past 20 years is the way in which within China itself, the past we've been talking about, of the Ming, of the Song, of early China, of the Han and the Tang, the literary and artistic creativity of the northern and southern dynasties period, that this has come once again into the discourse of modern China as something to be proud of, not something to walk away from, something that in fact is fundamental and important to existence of Chinese culture today. And as Chinese intellectuals and artists and literary figures and even political figures look out at the world and they say, what is it that China brings to the world? It's not only the acquisition of wealth, it's not only the extension of military power, it's also a cultural heritage that can be shared across the globe, that can become part of our heritage as citizens of the globe, as world citizens, that we all can partake in. And one of our goals in this course has not only been to tell you about how we think about China and how other scholars at Harvard and in the US think about China, but also to make that culture and that history and that civilization more accessible to you. When we began ChinaX, we had the plan that it would somehow be an automated course and we'd get it done and put it out there and it would just go on and take care of itself. And we found that you wanted to discuss things with us and we wanted to know more about you and discuss more things with you. And I think Professor Elliott noted this too. This has been one of the most rewarding parts of teaching ChinaX, the interaction with you, 46,000 people who signed up for ChinaX. We began with 32,000, and every week that's gone by, thousands more have joined. We're now at 46,000. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have had you as fellows in learning about China's history and culture. I want to thank you very much for being with us and look forward to seeing you when Professor Kirby is on this spot in the fall. Thank you.